President Trump continues to flout conservative orthodoxy with his populist approach to economic policy. The latest example, the government taking a 10% stake in the U.S. chip-making company Intel. The move has won Trump praise from some on the progressive left and scorn from some free market conservatives. Joining me to discuss, Emily Brooks, author of The Movement, a weekly newsletter tracking the influence and debates steering politics on the right. Emily, you have Bernie Sanders coming to President Trump's defense here. That's got to be a difficult place to be for many Republicans.
Yeah, absolutely. Republican Party and supporters of President Trump, of course, don't want to come out and criticize him on much of anything these days. But it is certainly an interesting sight when one of the first people to come out and praise his move to seek a 10% stake in Intel is self-described Democratic Socialist Bernie Sanders, leader of the populist wing of the Democratic Party. So very, strange bedfellows there, and not one that a lot of those free market conservatives are happy to see.
I remember during the Obama administration, there were all these complaints of crony capitalism and picking winners and losers when it came to government involvement in things like healthcare and clean energy investment. The fact that elected Republicans are relatively quiet now, does that show how much Trump has changed the Republican Party?
Absolutely, it does. It's just those aren't the type of issues that are motivating that conservative base. Those crony capitalism, picking winners and losers type rhetoric are what we heard a lot from the Tea Party era in around 2010 and in the years after. That really sprung up and in some ways helped support the rise of Trump, but not quite in his most populist instincts. And so a lot of, especially the conservative think tanks and Republicans are really of that Tea Party era, are really into the more libertarian ideal of separate government from business, don't have it involved in really anything that the business is doing. They don't even like the idea of giving grants to companies. They're pretty shocked by Trump and Howard Lutnick being so happy about this deal with Intel.
We have heard criticism from some Republicans. Senator Rand Paul called it a terrible idea and a step towards socialism. We've heard similar statements from some conservative think tanks. Are they going to do anything about it? Will there be any effort to maybe, block this? I'm not hearing a lot about any movement in Congress to try and block this right now. Of course, Republicans don't want to block much of anything that Trump does these days. And, a lot of them have very similarly been not thrilled about the new tariff regime that Trump has implemented, these sort of protectionist tariffs that are really making a lot in the business community nervous and really go against that conservative orthodoxy against higher taxes. And yet, we're not seeing that kind of movement that Congress could take that action to repeal the authority for the president to implement those tariffs. And with this being a pretty limited, right now, endeavor for the government to take that 10% stake of Intel, it's not quite the same as something broad-based. So I'm sure that many of them are just hoping that this is an isolated, limited instance, even if they're not happy about the principle of the matter. For the Republicans who are defending this, we heard from Missouri Senator Eric Schmitt over the weekend. He is one of them defending it on a national security basis. Tell me about the justification that they're making from a conservative perspective.
Well, the rationale is really the same as the whole idea of the CHIPS and Science Act that Congress passed under President Biden, which was part of the impetus for this deal is that you want to provide incentives for companies to go and create the types of industries that are going to be critical for the United States to have not only an edge in national security, but in things like industrial policy, not having to rely on foreign sources for all of these things like computer chips that are in everything these days. And with Intel being, American, I think the only American chip maker that's making chips in the United States, a lot of people see it as pretty important. And so that was part of the reason why they got
those billions of dollars in grants from the CHIPS and Science Act and other government programs in the first place. But they were going to get this money regardless. But what's interesting is that the deal that the Intel CEO struck with Trump is that now the government will take a 10% stake in Intel. And the idea is maybe the U.S. government could get some return on investment, and so later sell off those shares, hopefully for a profit. And, some people who are looking at this see it as a sort of a limited case, saying, the question isn't necessarily whether the government should take ownership of these companies, but whether in this particular deal it would be better if the government does so. So that is also more of a mid-road kind of analysis on the right about this.
How far does this go? You mentioned Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. He says the Pentagon is now considering equity in defense contractors like Lockheed Martin. Are there any limits to the Trump administration's level of involvement in the economy?
Well, I guess it depends on how far that these companies would want to go is a big question. There has been, a landmark Supreme Court case from many years ago saying that limiting the government's ability to sort of seize assets in private industry, even for national security purposes. But if the companies are willing to do so and they will give government a stake in their companies, then maybe that's up for debate. The Department of Defense also this year did strike another agreement with a minerals company to become the largest shareholder of that company, with some other agreements that are incentives for the Department of Defense. So it's not unheard of. Also, those familiar with the financial crisis in 2008 will remember the U.S. government took a majority stake in General Motors, eventually had a loss after selling off the rest of those shares. And so that is the risk for this. The big question is how many companies will actually be interested in wanting to do this.
All right, we will leave it at that. For more of Emily's insights, go over to thehill.com, click on newsletters, and you can have the movement sent right to your inbox. Emily Brooks, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.